Derrida Vis-a vis Lacan Introduction, For the Love of Lacan. And it is with this event, this justly deserved and spectacular homage to Lacan, that I was happy to be asked to associate myself. Not only but also because, in our time, and I mean the time of culture and especially Parisian culture, I find a political significance in this homage. I consider it an act of cultural resistance to pay homage publicly to a difficult form of thought, discourse, or writing, one which does not submit easily to normalization by the media, by academics, or by publishers, one which rebels against the restoration currently underway, against the philosophical or theoretical neo-conformism in general, let us not even mention literature, that flattens and levels everything around us, in an attempt to make one forget what the Lacan era was, along with the future and the promise of his thought, thereby raising the name of Lacan. As you know, there are countless ways to do this, sometimes very paradoxical ways. In his lifetime, Lacan underwent the experience of excommunication. Some of those who claim to draw on Lacan's name, and not just his legacy, can be not the least active or the least effective in this operation. Here, once again, the logic of the service rendered is highly tricky, and censorship, suturing, and defense of orthodoxy do not in the least exclude, quite the contrary, a facade of cultural eclecticism. Whether one is talking about philosophy, psychoanalysis, or theory in general, what the flat-footed restoration underway attempts to recover, disavow, or censor is the fact that nothing of that which managed to transform the space of thought in the last decades would have been possible one without some coming to terms with Lacan, without the Lacanian provocation, however one receives it or discusses it, and, I will add, without some coming to terms with Lacan in his coming to terms with the philosophers. One Derrida, it would seem, loves Lacan. It is, he insists, for the love of Lacan that he emphasizes the important political obligation to embrace a difficult thinking that rebels against normalization. Lacan in turn is not entirely averse to being loved by Derridians. Concerning a certain deconstructive reading, he is quoted as saying, I can say, in a way, if it is a question of reading, that I have never been read so well, with so much love too naturally enough. Derrida's love is not unconditional, as always, Lacan left me the greatest freedom of interpretation, and as always I would have taken it even if he had not left it to me, as it will have pleased me. One must, of course, read Lacan's texts with deconstructive vigilance, and, at least on the face of it, this is what Derrida aims to do. In turn, Lacanian psychoanalysis in principle must encourage inventive interpretation and independent thinking among its readers. Lacan, reflecting upon the veritable a priori of the Freudian doctrine, again on the face of it, does not expect unconditional love. To the contrary, he insists, all of us share an experience based upon a technique, a system of concepts to which we remain faithful, partly because this system was developed by the man who opened up to us all the ways to that experience, and partly because it bears the living mark of the different stages of its elaboration. That is to say, contrary to the dogmatism that is sometimes imputed to us, we know that this system remains open both as a whole and in several of its articulations. For seemingly tied together by mutual respect and resistance, it is fair to expect a Derridian/Lacanian philosophical legacy that reflects a dynamic interchange of ideas. Yet, for a complex set of reasons, there is relatively little productive interchange between deconstruction and Lacanian psychoanalysis. If Derrida and Lacan are named together with mantric regularity under the general banner of post-structuralism, more detailed work on the shape of an accord between their discourses is relatively scarce. One is more commonly confronted with mutual ignorance or resentment between Derridians and Lacanians. Interchange is characterized by clear misconstructions of either Derrida's thinking or Lacan's, or both. In consequence, the interface between deconstruction and psychoanalysis is at risk of becoming a limiting border rather than a permeable space of generative cross-fertilization. To the misconstruction of Derrida's thinking that trumps them all, as John Caputo points out, is the argument that he has destroyed his own grounds for protest about being misunderstood, since his anything-goes postmodernism undermines the very idea that there can be such a thing as misunderstanding. 5 There are two versions of this misconstruction. The first is derived from a catchphrase that Derrida, and those who love him, have good reason to regret sorely, namely, il n'y a pas de hors texte, there is no outside text. 6 Many take this phrase as confirmation of Derrida's apparently uninhibited celebration of an utterly nominalist, relativist free play of differences, supposedly based on the premise that there is nothing out there beyond the text, which dooms us to the infinite play of texts upon texts upon texts, all of indifferently equivalent non-value and endlessly referring to nothing but themselves. Derrida persistently and explicitly rejects this misreading, which is the contemporary equivalent of Hegel's mistaken characterization of Kant's transcendental turn as a subjective idealism, and it may be subjected to the same kind of rejoinder, namely, that transcendental constitution does not create existence, but interprets or synthesizes what is given, thereby constituting a phenomenal world. 7 Derrida's phrase there is no outside text makes the equivalent claim. Something must occur before there can be interpretation, i.e., texts, but there are no uninterpreted objects for us because it is precisely through the process of interpretation that they are first constituted as elements that belong to a phenomenal reality. In his words, I believe always in the necessity of being attentive first of all to this phenomenon of language, naming, and dating, to this repetition compulsion, at once rhetorical, magical, and poetic. To what this compulsion signifies, translates, or betrays. Not in order to isolate ourselves in language, as people in too much of a rush would like us to believe, but on the contrary, in order to try to understand what is going on precisely beyond language and what is pushing us to repeat endlessly and without knowing what we are talking about, precisely there where language and the concept come up against their limits. 8 The second misconception of Derrida's thinking derives from the phrase interpretation of interpretation. He is often correctly cited as describing two interpretations of interpretation, one that remains nostalgic for the kind of totalizing system of synthetic rules that Kant envisaged, and one that affirms the free play of interpretative differences. 9 He explicitly insists, in accordance with what he later calls the plural logic of the a priori, I will return shortly to this axial notion, that it is never a matter of choosing between them. Nevertheless, time and again he is taken to have made precisely a choice, for the side of unregulated play, that he expressly interdicts. Claims that Derridian thinking represents a cynical version of anything-goes postmodernism, based on such arguments, could only be the consequence of not having read his texts with sufficient care. 10 By now this kind of misconception should have given way to more balanced treatments of his thinking. Its persistence, nevertheless, can probably be attributed to the fact that it suits enthusiasts, who desire his endorsement for various anything-goes stratagems, as much as detractors, both of whom read his texts highly selectively, taking snippets here and there to support one-sided agendas. Even though the majority of Derrida's texts reveal a sustained engagement with psychoanalysis, his readings on topics other than language and the purloined letter draw little explicit attention from many Lacanian theorists, and citations more often than not take the form of typical misconstructions. For example, in a collection thematizing Lacan's theory of discourse, there is but a single reference to Derrida, which refers to Jacques Alan Miller's claim that in contrast to intellectuals such as Derrida, Lacan saw patience, that is, he put his theories to work in the world outside the esoteric self-referential circle of the academic text. 11 More importantly, when reference is made to Derrida, it is often to his early work on the sign, which is reduced to an endorsement of free play, a misreading that precludes serious engagement with his later writings on ethical issues in the broadest sense of the term, which are in constant dialogue with psychoanalysis. Karja Silverman's approach to Derrida's work provides a clear but by no means unique example of this reduction. In the subject of semiotics, she focuses on his commitment to the endless commutability of the signified 12 together with the principle of deferral, which is taken to mean simply that signification occurs along a chain in which one term displaces another before being itself displaced. 13. These commitments are brought together under the notion of free play. 14. While Silverman's observations are not inaccurate, and Derrida does indeed insist on this, an economic interpretation of difference, naming it difference as spacing, she gives no voice at all, at least not in Derrida's name, to its economic counterpart, namely difference as temporization. 15. I shall address this complexity in Chapter 3. Suffice it to note here that her one-sided starting point assures a reductive interpretation of other Derridean notions. For example, her remark in the acoustic mirror that Derrida has appropriated from sexual difference a signifier, namely invagination, with which he has attempted to erase the opposition between inner and outer, can only sound strange to Derridean ears. 16. For Silverman is not isolated in this respect. Even Joan Kopik, from whom, as will become apparent over the course of this study, I have learned the most concerning the Lacanian version of the plural logic of the a priori, assumes that the Lacanian equivalent, which she names the paradoxical logic of the whole, is the distinguishing factor that presses Lacan's thinking beyond Derrida's. 17. Her assessment here is consonant with Slavoj Zizek's, as reflected for example in his essay The Real of Sexual Difference. 18. Zizek's writing might be exceptional in the sense that it does indeed engage directly with Derrida's later work, but his treatment of it, as I hope to show in Chapter 2, is marred by one-sided reduction of difference to its an economic moment. On the other hand, it is Derrida himself who gives his readers apparent license to pass over Lacan's texts in silence. Judging by Derrida's explanation in the 1971 interview positions of the almost total absence of references to Lacan in his work up to that point, the reasons are complex, having to do with personal antagonisms, striking differences in intellectual temperament, and, least of all, in my view, clear theoretical differences. 19. First, Derrida accuses Lacan of an aggressive response to his own work that takes the form of kettle logic or the accumulation of incompatible assertions. In his words, 1. Devaluation and rejection, it is worthless or I do not agree. 2. Valuation and reappropriation, moreover it is mine and I have always said so. 20. The justice of the accusation is questionable, and despite the avowedly minor importance Derrida attaches to it, there is no doubt that it contributes to the antagonistic tone of subsequent interchanges. 21. In this odd game of getting even, as Barbara Johnson puts it, the priority of aggression is doubled by the aggressiveness of priority. 22. More seriously, Derrida charges Lacan with a cavalier, facile, and obfuscating use of metaphysically loaded terms such as being authentic. Full true without subjecting this rhetoric to the necessary philosophical rigor. The interview is characterized throughout by a compulsively repetitive refrain to this effect, to wit, despite many elliptical and rhapsodic variations, since then I have never encountered any rigorous questioning, but in the absence of any theoretical and systematic explanation, to resolve such problems in a phrase seems to me rather slight, a light-handed reference, but without any specific investigation he sums up the charge as follows, in relation to the theoretical difficulties that interested me, I read this style, above all, as an art of evasion. The vivacity of ellipsis too often seemed to me to serve as an avoidance or an envelopment of diverse problems. 23. 5. Moreover, Derrida argues that Lacan's supposedly casual rhetoric leaves him novelly trapped within the so-called metaphysics of presence. While he might wax lyrical about loving Lacan in Resistances of Psychoanalysis, he does not shift his critical stance in this later text. Instead, he speaks here of the ironic chiasmus between himself as a deconstructive philosopher and Lacan as a philosophizing psychoanalyst, which makes Lacan's discourse, in his words, too much at home with the philosophers. 24. Backed by Derrida's damning criticism, it is unfortunate but unsurprising that many Derridians on this account tend to avoid even opening Lacan's texts. Despite the fact that psychoanalysis haunts Derrida's own texts, it does not fare well in the commentaries on Derrida's work. Caputo's deconstruction in a nutshell, for example, seems to cover everything but psychoanalysis, and Bennington's Derrida base offers suggestive but extremely cursory remarks concerning Derrida's encounters with psychoanalysis. This is all the more surprising since it deals with the quintessentially psychoanalytical theme of singular subjectivity. 25. Many Derridians, moreover, uncritically trusting Derrida's assessment, make the fundamental mistake of assuming from the start that Lacan's discourse is characterized by an essentialism that belongs within the ambit of the metaphysics of presence. Derrida argues that in the thinking of difference, one puts into question the authority of presence, or of its simple symmetrical opposite, absence or lack. Thus one questions the limit which has always constrained us to formulate the meaning of being in general as presence or absence, in the categories of being or beingness, Alzia. 26. By contrast, he charges Lacan with the hypostatization of lack or, that is, the formulation of the meaning of being in general as absence, which implies that his discourse does not move beyond the categories of being. Lacan denies this charge emphatically, arguing a similar point. The thinking of the real, he insists, does not lend itself to ontology. It is neither being, nor non-being, but the unrealized. 27. Again, in response to the argument of the title of the letter, whose authors remain subject to precisely this prejudice, Lacan insists to the contrary that it cannot be ambiguous that I oppose to the concept of being, as it is sustained in the philosophical tradition, the notion that we are duped by jouissance. 28. In fact, Lacan grumbles, it is as if it were precisely upon reaching the impasse to which my discourse is designed to lead them that they considered their work done, declaring themselves, or rather declaring me, which amounts to the same thing given their conclusions. Confounded. 29. Nevertheless, many thinkers continue blithely to ignore Lacanian protests and typically misconstrue Lacan's claims, taking them as evidence of 6. A closet essentialism. Caputo offers a clear description of this prejudice in his exposition of Drusilla Cornell's treatment of Lacan's claim that woman does not exist. 30. Cornell, he reports, expresses disappointment in Lacan for undermining the revolutionary implications of this statement by insisting, as Caputo puts it, that woman is essentially the truth of castration, or of the whole, essentially the place of the lack. Moreover, by contrast, a Derridean approach is supposed to provide the corrective for Lacan's phallocentric essentialism. Derrida turns Lacan's statement around into a statement of non-essentialism. Woman does not exist if existence is given the sense of fixed identity and permanent presence. She does not exist, not out of lack or defect but excess, for the feminine disrupts the proper place, including and especially the proper place to which she is assigned by Lacan as lack. 31. According to Kopik, then, the interpretative mistake many keep making is to take what Lacan calls the hard kernel of the real to be some essence or quasi-transcendental a priori that manages to escape the contingent processes of history. 32. This is, again, the mistake Judith Butler makes, for example, in her reading of Lacan's account of sexual difference, where she takes the real of sexual difference to imply an a priori gender dimorphism in Lacanian discourse, conditioned by normative heterosexuality, which, as usual, defines woman as the negative of man. 33. Again, Lacanians deny this charge of covert phallocentrism, an admission such as Colette Solar's, for example, that Lacan indeed affirms the phallocentrism of the unconscious must be placed within the context of his wholesale revaluation of values, for example, in Seminar XX, where such an affirmation can only function as a critique of the one-sided phallic logic that characterizes the symbolic order. 34. Derrida may be right that Lacan does not always explicitly offer rigorous philosophical explanations for the terms he uses, and readers regularly preface their works with caveats concerning Lacan's style. Dylan Evans, for example, remarks that Lacan's psychoanalytic language has often been accused of being infuriatingly obscure and sometimes of constituting a totally incomprehensible psychotic system 35, but as many commentators have demonstrated, this by no means justifies the charge of philosophical facileness. I disagree without qualification with Derrida's characterization of Lacanian discourse as so different from his own in its mode of elocution, its site, its aims, its presuppositions that reference to it would only result in the accumulation of fog in a field already not lacking in it 36-7. In fact, quite to the contrary, one faces a curious mirroring symmetry here. On the one hand, in contrast to the utter nominalism attributed to Derrida, on the basis of a fundamentally one-sided misconstrual of difference, Lacan is supposed to offer a far more sophisticated, complex, paradoxical style of thinking. On the other hand, in contrast to Lacan's apparent closet essentialism, a characterization derived from a fundamental misconception of the Lacanian real, Derrida is supposed to offer a far more sophisticated, complex, paradoxical style of thinking. The obvious move, I should think, is to step back from the mutual antagonism that has built up around these thinkers and compare what the Lacanians say about Lacan with what the Derridians say about Derrida. One finds that this comparison yields the interesting result of a rather precise match. The style of thinking underpinning Lacanian psychoanalytic theory precisely matches the plural logic of the agraria by which Derrida describes his own quasi-transcendental thinking. In other words, as I hope to show here, it is easy enough to detect a deep theoretical accord between them, the explication of which would help clarify the field within which both operate. The field in question is that opened up by Kant's critique of ontology and his consequent transcendental turn according to which human cognitive powers are implicated in the constitution of phenomenal reality. One might say that the overall task of this study is to demonstrate that both Derrida and Lacan carefully insist not only upon Kant's transcendental turn but also on a second paradigm shift, reflected in Lacan's thinking of the impossible real and Derrida's equivalent thinking of difference, whereby transcendental thinking, which concerns itself with the conditions that make what is given in experience possible, becomes quasi-transcendental 37. Quasi-transcendental thinking, as the nickname suggests, does not step beyond the transcendental paradigm but remains parasitic upon it even as it ruins it, by adding that economic conditions of possibility are simultaneously the very uneconomic conditions that also make the given, strictly speaking, impossible. As the logic of such aporetic impossibility, then, quasi-transcendental thinking names a qualified, relatively ruined form of transcendental thinking from which there is no escape, there is no restituting return from the paradoxical state of being to an ancient beginning, and no remedy in a projected ideal. Derrida has proposed various keys for gaining access to quasi-transcendental thinking besides the now notorious term deconstruction in his words. A thinking of the non-finite number of quasi-concepts announced in the movement of deconstruction is certainly called for by a thinking of writing as demonstrated in much of his earlier work. 38 However, he maintains that this deconstructive movement is better thematized and formalized in its relation to the double bind, to the stricture of the double band and, especially, of the remaining that is not and that does not stem from ontology any more than it lends itself to dialectical sublation 39 in Agrarius. Therefore, Derrida prefers to formalize the logic that explains the persistence of such quasi-concepts in terms of the strictures imposed by three different forms of agraria, namely, the economic agraria of closure or totality, the uneconomic agraria of openness or infinity, and, finally, the agraria of paradox. This agraria describes the agraria of the agrarius, or, that is, the double bind or dilemma that arises because the first two agrarius are joined together as a paradox, since, as just mentioned, economic conditions of possibility, the conditions of systematic closure, while necessary, are ruined by the equally necessary and economic moment intrinsic to them. Derrida also names this agraria the impossible 40. Consequently, under the obligation to negotiate the ruin of the transcendental paradigm, as neither fully in it nor properly outside, his readers must expect to find themselves tied up, along with him, in the complex plural logic of the agraria that has imposed itself on his thinking with what he calls a formalizable regularity 41. This kind of thinking does not aim to contradict the age-old tradition of formal logic, and it by no means denies its necessity and force. Nevertheless, Derrida exploits its resources for non-traditional purposes, that is, not for the sake of reducing, clarifying, or simplifying philosophically interesting issues but, on the contrary, to insist upon their irreducible complexities. Without claiming expertise in the language game of formal logic, it seems clear enough to me that Derrida's articulation of life's inevitable antagonisms takes the argumentative form of dilemma, paradox, or agraria, rather than that of the strict contrary or contradictory oppositions within which either forward/or choices still make sense. William Anders Sinclair formalizes a dilemma as follows: if P, then Q, and if not P then R, where both Q and R, one should add, are equally unsatisfactory, but either P or not P, either Q or R. Hence the double bind of having to choose between equally unsatisfactory alternatives. 42 This is a slightly more elaborate form of what Simon Blackburn calls the simplest form of a dilemma, which is an argument of the form if P then Q, namely a particular unsatisfactory outcome, if not P then Q, that is, precisely the same unsatisfactory outcome, so in any event Q. 43 Clearly, here, either forward/or choices make no sense, for the alternatives, inclusively, either remain equally unsatisfactory or, in the end amount to precisely the same unsatisfactory outcome. Derrida insists, however, that this difficulty, that is, the impossibility of a choice ever being completely satisfactory, 9 does not obviate the necessity for actively going ahead and negotiating such choices. Lacan similarly became increasingly concerned with developing a theoretical discourse of rupture and inconsistency, and according to Lee, he assiduously studied paradox, set theory, logical puzzles, classic Greek paradoxes, the paradoxical Mobius surfaces of topology and Borromean knots. 44 He also demonstrates a correlative enjoyment of the mind-twisting grammatical constructions available to the play of language. For example, as Paul Verheyen notes, if corporeal contingency is inscribed in the phrase to not stop being written, Lacan writes necessity as it doesn't stop being written and impossibility as it doesn't stop not being written. 45 These figures and enjoyments already indicate that his interests lie in the direction of paradox. Pressing this point further, one may argue that the so-called fundamental concepts of Lacanian psychoanalysis are articulated according to a complex, paradoxical relationality that precisely matches the plural logic of the agraria. I do not at this point wish to enter into the full complexity of Lacanian discourse. Suffice it to mention here that Lacan's formulation of the real as rupture introduces the double trouble that copied names the problem of the all and characterizes as an opposition between paranoid universalism and hysterical nominalism, which matches Derrida's distinction between the economic and uneconomic agrarias. 46 Notably, Lacan names the logic of their articulation the veil of alienation and, with a touch of black humor, offers as an example the mugger's choice, your money or your life. 47 This turns out to be no choice at all, for, as Koplik notes, once the choice is offered, you're done for, no matter which alternative you take. 48 The Hegelian lose proposed here, then, is that in choosing one the other is lost, yet, because they are interdependent, this is also thereby to lose the original choice, for life is the necessary condition for having money, and, these days, money is the necessary condition for having a life. Lacan defines the task of psychoanalysis as that of leading analysans to the point where they may make the move beyond the lose/lose situation of the mugger's choice. Notably then, as Koppig demonstrates, Lacan, like Derrida, one should note, refuses the limitations of a choice between the a priori of paranoiac universalism and hysterical nominalism and prefers a third stance, which invokes the win-forward/win formulation of the revolutionary's choice, freedom or death. 49 counter to the commonsensical claim, namely, that the freedom that costs a life is not freedom. The revolutionary's choice issues from the insistence that life without freedom is not life. 50. Here, to choose to fight for freedom, to the point of risking all for its sake, is to retain the eternal freedom of a Che Guevara. On the other hand, to choose death rather than forsake one's freedom similarly leaves intact forever the freedom of a Socrates. But what is the meaning of this freedom in Lacanian psychoanalysis? It names, first, freedom from the economic and aneconomic aparias of ideological automatism and paralyzing transgression for its own sake. Correlatively, this is a freedom for decisive action. When it comes down to it, then, this freedom for as the only possible freedom is the paradoxical freedom offered by refusal to submit to the constrictions of the either/or choice given by a binary determination of options and the willingness in consequence to brave the double bind of the a priori of aparias, or, that is, all of the ethical, political, or, as broadly speaking as possible, conceptual paradoxes and dilemmas that can neither be overcome nor evaded but must be worked through interminably. As I hope to show in the investigations to follow, both Derrida and Lacan in their singular ways devise the same inventive, paradoxical logic by means of which one may grasp and put into practice the revolutionary's choice. In this sense, for both thinkers, all binary determinations, regulated by the mugger's choice, must make way for a third style of thinking supported by another logic that exceeds the binary. Accordingly, the logic reflected in the Lacanian response to the Vel of alienation formalized as the revolutionary's choice can be generalized as a heuristic that allows one to gather together what Lacan says in relation to diverse themes in a way that gives his ideas a formalizable coherence yet remains subtle and complex enough not to flatten them into a system. This enables one to show, as one example among many, that his theory of the transcendental relation is not a product of unmitigated structuralism, as some might insist, but of, in Bruce Fink's felicitous phrase, a Gödelian structuralism in which every system is decompleted by the alterity or heterogeneity it contains within itself. 51. One should not miss the striking resonance here with Derrida's formulation of the a priori of the aparias, that is, the double bind that arises as a consequence of the fact that the uneconomic moment intrinsic to all economic conditions of possibility ruins any hope for their perfection. The ultimate aim of this study is to counter the adversarial trend according to which, ironically, symmetrically opposed misconstructions on both sides convert the Lacan/Derrida encounter into a mugger's choice by contrast. At the risk of a repetition compulsion, I repeat my hope that in the end I will have demonstrated that the plural logic of the a priori offers a means to break through the impasse of mutual Derridian/Lacanian antagonism and a key to a more productive interchange between deconstruction and Lacanian psychoanalysis. The significance of such an 11 accord is tied to the importance for dealing with practical issues in everyday life, claimed for both by Derridians and Lacanians alike, and to the dangers of not taking either seriously. Against those blessed souls who claim to have gone beyond psychoanalysis, Koppig insists that the revolutionary insights of psychoanalysis, which remains the mother tongue of our modernity, lie ahead of us rather than behind. 52 In a similar vein, Caputo takes up Derrida's deconstructive critique of hermeneutics not to get beyond the hermeneutics but to liberate its revolutionary tendencies against the metaphysical desire to make things safe which, ironically, has become consummately dangerous. He argues, then, that a radicalized hermeneutics enables us to face with less innocence the fix we are in. 53 However, stylistically speaking, each discourse is frustratingly and unnecessarily difficult and tends toward a jargonistic hermeticism that restricts it to circulation among a small group of dedicated initiates, placing a not inconsequential obstacle in the way of greater cross-fertilization. It is hardly surprising that both are widely misinterpreted by followers and adversaries alike. As Lee notes, Lacan's discourse is loaded with multi-referential and multilingual wordplay neologisms, portmanteau words, and more or less spectacular puns.